Hey, everybody. Welcome to All the Fanfare. This is Eric Pierce. I'm joined today by my good friend, author, cinephile, Simon Dillon. Say hello, Simon.
Hello.
And I asked Simon on to be my very first podcast guest for a reason. A, he's a brilliant writer. He knows films inside and out. And I thought Temple of Doom, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, I thought would be a good fodder for our discussion. I think we both grew up on the movie. We both love the movie, but I think we both see it quite differently. And that's kind of where I want to jump in here. I think, would it be accurate to say Temple of Doom is your third favorite Indiana Jones film, Simon?
Yes, I mean, I would say it's third favorite, but I want to be very clear about this. Um, I mean, Raiders of the Lost Ark, as far as I'm concerned, is the greatest adventure film ever made, and I will brook no argument with that. So that was never going to, that was always going to be top of the pile for me. However,
Hmm.
Last Crusade comes close second, I would say, but primarily because of Sean Connery. I think were Sean Connery not in that one, I would definitely go with Temple of Doom because I think um, visually it's a very, very, very different beast to Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I love how different it is compared with the first film. Whereas I think Last Crusade, visually at least, retreads a lot of Raiders territory. So yes, on points it's the third best. Sean Connery is the trump card, but I do think were it not for that, Temple of Doom would be my second choice.
Now that's interesting, because I think for me, Temple is a very distant third. I love the first. I love Raiders and Last Crusade for the same reasons. I think Raiders is the classic adventure yarn. Last Crusade brings in Sean Connery, and he is the trump card. And in some ways, Raiders I consider the better movie, and I consider Crusade my more favorite movie because it's more lighthearted, it's more fun. We get the dynamic of the father son, which always pulls on my heartstrings. And so for me, those two stand head and shoulders on kind of the top tier, and then Temple of Doom is way down lower, above
But
the more
I
recent
think what
ones.
you just said there, I think what you just said there is very interesting when you said it was your favourite
Yep.
out of the two, Last Crusade over Temple of Doom. And I think this is probably why I rate Temple of Doom that much higher, because you said you like something light-hearted, you like something I like a father-son dynamic and a light-hearted thing too. Don't get me wrong, I think Last Crusade is terrific. But I also like a dark, twisted fairy tale. And Temple of Doom to me has always been an extremely dark, grim, almost like Grimm's fairy tale, with a really evil, sadistic stuff that's in there. That for me, when I saw it at 9 years old, made perfect sense to me as a 9-year-old child.
Mhm.
Obviously, it horrified adults in some cases, but for me as a 9-year-old child, I loved how extreme it was. I loved the fact that there was nothing remotely condescending about it to children. And, all of my friends, all the children that I knew at the time, absolutely reveled in the sort of nastiness and the gore and the bugs and all of that sort of stuff. And so, really, that's obviously a very personal perspective. But I actually do think against that as well. On a visual level, as filmmaking, it's extremely good. I mean, the beauty of the subterranean temple set. I mean, that's such a well lit set. It's visually astonishing. I think it's got some of Spielberg's best direction. Not just in the big action set pieces, but also in there's some there are some wonderful moments of comedy. That I mean, you said you like comedy. I love the bit with Willie Scott and Indiana Jones
Yeah,
when they're
they're in the
just before they
bedrooms,
find the
right?
secret passage and they're having all that banter about whether they're going to sleep together and so on. And it's
Yep.
very funny, and the way it's cut, edited with the 5 minutes, four and a half, that whole thing. I find that highly amusing, and it's sort of a throwback to the sort of 30s, 40s rom com thing, which I think it's a lot of fun. And so there are some things there for the adults, but I do think Temple of Doom is primarily for children. This is one of the reasons why I think it didn't do so well, and why adults, I think, posthumously, with more more clear sightedly say, okay, this went at least three bridges too far in terms of how gruesome and whatnot it was for children. But the fact is that I am still at heart a 9-year old nasty-minded schoolboy who just likes the kind of visceral nature of it. And obviously, I write horror novels, as you know, and I write dark fairy tales and things. And so I think Temple of Doom just appeals to my sensibilities in a few interesting ways. And I do think the simplicity of the good versus evil nature of the story, um, I think it appeals more to children than to adults because children understand that. They understand sort of Dickensian cruelty. They understand, the child slavery and all of that, and the black magic and the all that evil that's in the story.
Hmm.
It's something I think children can relate to more, I suspect, than and you see Indiana Jones is a straightforward hero in this story. In fact, he isn't in all the subsequent Indiana Jones films. Whereas in Raiders, he's a more complex character. He's just as obsessed as the villain, and twice he abandons Marion to pursue the Ark. And he's a grave robber.
Yep, he is.
He's a much more mercenary character in the original film compared with the second film, which again I think why the second film is ironically more appropriate for children.
Yeah. It's a couple of things you said there that I want to key on. The last thing, I'm going to jump on the last thing first. Chronologically, and this was something I didn't know for quite a while, but Temple comes first in the sequence. So Temple of Doom occurs earlier in Indiana Jones' timeline than Raiders. So to your point about in Temple of Doom, he's more heroic. By the time we meet him in Raiders of the Lost Ark, he's a grave robber. He's kind of Han Solo, duplicitous. I'm in it for the money and glory. It's interesting that shift that happens between the movies, considering that Temple actually comes first in the sequence.
Well, just to pick up on that, that's a nerd point that I think a lot of. I mean, to be honest, I'll just be honest with you. Probably just the way my brain works. When I saw Temple of Doom in the cinema the first time I saw it, it's like comes up at the start, Shanghai 1935. I just thought, oh, it's a year before Raiders. Fine. That
Hmm.
didn't, to me, the chronology is almost irrelevant. And I think that, by the way, it's also very telling that when I saw those films in the cinema, Raiders and Temple of Doom on a double bill. Okay, when Temple of Doom was before Last Crusade came out, but I saw them on a double bill, and they played Raiders first, Raiders then Temple of Doom. And the thing is, they don't give a damn about the chronology because I think, unlike the Star Wars films, I think the Indiana Jones films only pretend to be sequels or prequels or
Yes.
whatever. I mean,
Yep.
you can go on any internet forum you like and see this sort of level of nitpicking. And people say, oh, the sequel, and no, you mean the prequel. Oh, sorry, I mean the prequel. I think they're separate stories. And so I think, in a sense, the character development point is kind of moot because
Yep.
I think, I mean, there are obviously, I think in later films there are obviously callbacks to Marion and so on, but I think in the original vision for the series there wasn't really meant to be any kind of serious chronology.
Yeah.
Now
You're
Lucas changed that obviously because he did the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles and he did, and so on and so on. So it sort of gradually developed a lore of its own. But I don't think it was ever designed that way at that stage.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The prequel element was introduced solely because they didn't want to run back Nazis as the villains. So
Right.
they moved it before World War II, before the Nazis, and then that way you have a different antagonist, good or bad. I mean, the Nazis are sort of undefeated as Indiana Jones villains. They still are the top
Well,
ones,
that's
but
that's another interesting point because the Nazis are, as I've said, if you look at Raiders of the Lost Ark, you can do anything with Nazis. You can stab
mhm.
them, shoot them, burn them, run them over with trucks, and have God melt
Melt
their
their
faces off.
faces.
You know, and you'll still get a PG certificate. Now,
Yep.
Temple of Doom, the bit trickier because the horrible stuff starts happening to, like, for example, the innocent sacrifice victim who has his heart ripped out and then gets lowered
Yep.
into boiling lava, burns alive. I mean, that's an unbelievably horrific scene. Which, by the way, and this is I know this is leading into one of your points about the rating, but
Hmm.
in the UK, it had a whopping 1 minute and 6 seconds cut out of it to get it to a PG certificate in
Wow.
1984. And this is actually, I'm rather amused by this, and I'll tell you why, because it really doesn't make a huge difference. Ironically, the sequence is still horrible. Okay, so you only get in the old UK, it's all uncut now, but in the old
Mhm.
UK prints, you only see like one shot of the heart in his hand, and the fiery death has almost been removed entirely. There's a few other cuts elsewhere in the film, but it's mostly to that sacrifice scene. And James Furman, who was then head of the BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification in London, he flew to America to sit with Steven Spielberg and recut it to get the UK version. I mean, that was the extent they went to. They were so concerned about it,
Hmm.
and and so it came out in the UK, and still people complained, even in that version. Oh, it's too terrifying for the children. We all loved it. And there was some hilarious. There was some hilariously adults giving themselves nosebleeds over this. But then one thing I do remember, sorry, this is a bit of a personal anecdote, but Christmas Day 1987, BBC One, 3:10 p.m. in the afternoon, just after the Queen's speech, they show Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom for the first time on terrestrial television, 3 years after it had been in cinemas. So we didn't have a video player in those days, and so I was like, yay, great, Temple of Doom, sat down to watch it. And I sat there and I was increasingly annoyed because they kept censoring it. Even, you understand, it was already censored, but they censored it
Right.
even further for the BBC broadcast. So I was getting annoyed at my 12-year-old self. It's like, they've cut this. Whilst the various relatives who we had over on Christmas Day were increasingly horrified, even in that version. Okay. And then one thing that I thought it got a lot of complaints. The BBC got a lot of complaints that this was not an appropriate film to show in Christmas Day afternoon. And on the Radio Times letters page, which was the TV listings magazine, famous TV listings magazine in the UK, they had a cartoon which featured two children sitting gleefully on the sofa watching the television and a bunch of adults hiding behind the sofa. And the caption underneath read, "It's terrifying for the children," which I think sums up the point I'm making. Anyway, which again obviously leads into what you were going to say about the American side of things, the PG-13 rating.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that at this time in 1984 we had PG and R here in the US, right? And then Steven Spielberg was instrumental in the creation of the PG-13 rating. Not only did he advocate for it, but three of his films were kind of what pushed for the creation of this. Because speaking of Temple of Doom, Raiders of the Lost Ark was very family friendly, so I think parents took their kids to see Temple of Doom and then were aghast at the scenes of heart ripping out and child endangerment and all kinds of these things, black magic, human sacrifices, all this stuff that's in the movie. And around the same time, we have Gremlins and Poltergeist, and those are all films that push the envelope on what people considered safe, or actually safe for kids to watch, or
Well,
comfortable with their children watching, is
I
really
was
what
just
it
going to
boils
say
down
those
to.
three films I think are the three films that created the PG-13 rating.
Yep. Yeah. Yep.
So
Absolutely. The it's funny though, going back to what you were saying earlier, for me, Temple stands apart from all the other Indiana Jones films because of its tone. And even as a kid, I disliked it. And this is, I grew up in some ways because when I was a kid, my favorite Star Wars movies was Return of the Jedi, and Empire Strikes Back was my least favorite because it was the darkest. And as I matured and I saw the light, I see, okay, obviously Empire is the greatest. It happens to be the darkest, but it is the greatest Star Wars movie.
I know what you're
Uh,
referring to there, just on Star Wars very quickly, because when I was 13 years old, I had the revelation that Empire was the greatest. But up to that
yeah,
point, like you, I'd preferred the other two.
yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
was safely a teenager when I realized, okay, Empire is actually the best of these movies. And some of the stuff, like in Return of the Jedi, the Ewoks, those I soured on some of that stuff. I think that's natural with maturing. But with Temple of Doom, as I've gotten older, it's still my least favorite of the original three by a pretty safe margin. I think there's some there's some tonal elements to the film, and I think if you read some of what was going on in the lives of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, they were both going through personal issues. Lucas had just gone through a divorce. Spielberg had gone through a messy breakup, and they were bringing this kind of angst and mood into the film and just kind of channeling, almost using it's in some ways it's the purest form of art because they're putting their selves into the movie and what they're experiencing, and using art almost as a cathartic situation to process those feelings. But then the output is, scenes of child slavery and the moment where the guy gets his heart ripped out. And as if that's not bad enough, he gets his still a beating heart ripped out of his chest, and then they drop him down into the flames where he,
I mean, let's
bursts.
let's just take that scene for a moment as a metaphor for both Lucas and Spielberg and the divorce. But
Yep,
but here's the interesting thing, okay, about that. Because I've listened to a lot of interviews with both of them. Now, Lucas is unrepentant. Okay, I
yep.
don't think he cares. His whole thing is like, whatever, I don't care. It was what I wanted to do, and it's interesting to me, at any rate, that Marsha Lucas, who was George Lucas's wife, who actually, by the way, one of the great unsung heroes of Star Wars, she helped edit that film into
Absolutely.
shape. She just
Yep.
a
She
bang up
saved
job
it.
on that film.
Yep.
Yes, arguably yes. I mean, did an amazing job with it. But left George Lucas, and I'm what I think just before Return of the Jedi came out. So I'm not surprised that was sloshing around in his subconscious. And I wonder if it wasn't a bit deliberate. It's like, yeah, you've ripped my heart out, and now I'm burning alive. It's a sort of stupid black magic thing that makes absolutely no sense in the film whatsoever. You know, but um, in fact, I think there's even a hint, just as an aside, there's even a hint in the film that maybe what they're seeing isn't real, like the heart coming out, because obviously they don't do it to Willie when they try and sacrifice her. They just dunk her straight in the lava. And
Yeah.
then later on, when it happens to Indiana Jones, you don't see it either. I'm wondering if it's is it some psychosomatic thing? Is it supposed to be all in the mind and they're seeing it? It's an illusion for everyone else there, or is it really happening? And I don't think it really matters either way because the guy gets burned alive. But you know,
Right.
I just thought that's an interesting thing if you're going to take it as a metaphor for Lucas. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm giving George Lucas too much credit, and it's not that at all. But but you know, but as far as Spielberg's concerned, he has gone on the record and said that there's no personal feeling whatsoever for him in that film. So he was just there as a hired gun to direct the thing, because he said he'd do three of them with George Lucas. Now
Right.
I don't know that I buy that either, because he may say that consciously, but subconsciously, again, he's going through a divorce. And so maybe he did lean into the nastier stuff that little bit more. Um, and sometimes you and I know certainly I look back on some of the things I've written and I think, yeah, must have been in a bad mood when I wrote that. Yeah. So
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. It creeps into the art. I think kind of related to that. uh, in my recent viewing, I watched it just before we did this podcast. I watched it last week, and it struck me that to talk about the metaphor of what the movie actually could be saying. Uh, it seemed like there has elements of kind of the dad divorce genre. So you have, this is the only Indiana Jones movie with where you have a child sidekick, a child that is a main part of the cast. Short Round. He clearly looks at Indiana Jones as a surrogate father, and we see moments where he is intentionally and purposefully watching Indiana Jones and mimicking his actions. He wears Indiana Jones's hat at some points. Um, it also has some of that single dad energy where dad's bringing the kids into things that he probably shouldn't be, and mom certainly wouldn't approve of. But it's dad's weekend with the kids, so he brings them on these adventures, puts them in jeopardy.
it's one
I think
hell of a
there's a
weekend with the
metaphor.
kids.
It could be. I think there's also some metaphors here. You've got the evil palace that steal the children, and I think if you're looking at it from a divorce, a lot of, at least in the '80s, the way divorce went down, the dad got the kid every other weekend, and otherwise they didn't see them. You had the court separating the father and their children. You have at one point our hero Indiana Jones is forced to drink this bitter brew that turns him into this mindless sadist character who then doesn't recognize his own child, his quote unquote child, and strikes him. Right. I think there's some interesting nuggets, you if you go looking for them, that are there, whether they're intentional or not. I think it is interesting though that it does feel like a product of divorce or something where maybe Lucas or Spielberg, or just it's just there. But I'm curious what your thoughts on that.
I think you're absolutely dead on there. I think that's I mean, again, I don't think it's necessarily consciously done, but I think that it's a very interesting way of interpreting it along those lines. The surrogate father thing, I think, is very clear, especially and as you say, there's the sense again. This feeds into what I said earlier about this being relatable for children. There's that awful sense of betrayal because for me, as
Hmm.
a kid, as a 9-year-old, Short Round was my favorite part of the film because it's like,
Absolutely.
yeah, you can go on a really dangerous adventure with Indiana Jones right into the sort of heart of darkness, and it's fine as long as Indiana Jones is still Indiana Jones. But then what happens when he isn't and he's brainwashed with the, you know, voodoo in India? Let's get into the cultural, disparities in a moment. But,
Yeah, that's
you
a
know,
landmine.
yes, I mean that is a landmine, but to a 9-year-old, it's just taken on metaphorical terms, like he's under an evil spell, and and then as you say, he hits him, and that's just an appalling betrayal, and you really
Hmm.
feel it. At least I did as a 9-year-old. You really feel that betrayal, and then of course there's that lovely little moment after he comes to, when he gives him his cap back and he gives him his hat back, and and there's just, it's understated, but it's really nice. That this was, they've reconciled, and I think those are important moments. And I think just again to feed into what I was saying about the appropriateness for children, it all ends happily. I mean,
Hmm.
the thing about Temple of Doom, I mean, if anything, I remember being faintly disappointed with the ending because it's so bright, colourful, and cheerful, and sort of, yay, everyone's saved and happy, and life has returned to the village, and hurrah. And it's all so kind of, up compared with
Hmm.
what you got earlier. That on the one hand, yes, it's more appropriate for children. It's that fairy tale thing again that I told you about. But I remember thinking, maybe I was just, my critical brain as a 9-year-old was probably ten years ahead of where I was physically. I remember thinking that the ending of the Raiders was so much more interesting because you've got that, the fact that he goes into basically Area 51 in the Ark of the Covenant gets locked away, and
Yes.
it's, and the irony of that ending really hit me, and I just thought they don't even realize what they've got. And then my brain sort of went in 100 directions. I started thinking, well, maybe they researched it after all, and maybe that's where they maybe got involved in the Manhattan Project, and maybe the nuclear weapons, maybe, my brain went in 10 directions. Like, what did they do with the Ark? It was so
Hmm.
much more interesting to me, that sort of uncertainty, than any of the endings of any of the other films. So but anyway, that's an aside. Sorry, I shouldn't talk about Raiders. A bit
No, hey, it's
sidetracked.
all related. It's you can't. I don't think you. I think a lot of people's feelings about Temple of Doom, it's hard to separate those from how we feel about Raiders of the Lost Ark. I think Raiders of the Lost Ark casts a really long shadow, and when you talk about Temple of Doom, it's almost impossible to just talk about it on its own merits, because even unintentionally you're thinking about Raiders because it's such a classic film, it's such a classic character, it's one of Harrison Ford's best performances. So you're naturally going to compare them, even unintentionally. You're going to make that comparison. So I think it's natural that it comes up. I guess there is. That's a good segue. There is one thing I want to get your take on. In talking about comparing these two films. So Raiders of the Lost Ark has this classic opening. It's basically without dialogue. It's just Indiana Jones going into the temple. You could basically shoot it as a silent film, and it would work just as well. Where he's going into the temple, he's dealing with the trap, he's chased by the boulders, all that stuff that happens. No dialogue or very little. I haven't watched Temple, or I haven't watched it in a while, but you could do that as a silent film. Temple of Doom opens with a very loud dance number,
Oh, I love
and
that. I
for me it was a, yeah, I mean, it's a, this is, you're no longer in Kansas kind of moment, but also it just strikes me as a weird moment, and I'm not a fan of it. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Okay, well, I love it, and I mean, it's Cole Porter's "Anything Goes" in Mandarin, and orchestrated by the great John Williams, who,
Yep.
by the way, I just want to say this just in case we don't cover it elsewhere. His score for Temple of Doom is remarkable. And especially the absolutely terrifying Kali chant, human sacrifice thing, which
Yes.
again, that's
Yes.
all John Williams, that's all an original John Williams composition. It's, not as certain delusional, ignorant evangelical preachers tried to convince me that it was an occult ceremony that really existed. No, it's a John Williams composition. Okay, I mean, it's just like, anyway. But no, it's interesting because um, the thing I love about, one of the many things I love about John Williams is the only person who can in a sense, top John Williams is John Williams. And what he does, he
Hmm.
did the same thing with The Empire Strikes Back. He did the same thing with the Jurassic Park sequel, is to say, okay, I'm going to completely disregard the score for the first film, except for the main theme, which I'll bring back here and there. And most of what I'm going to do will be new material. And obviously, he absolutely knocked that out of the park with The Empire Strikes Back. In this one, I think he does brilliantly too. I mean, it's just lovely moments. The short round theme, there are various other themes in the film that I really like. I love the way he mingles the short round theme with the Indiana Jones theme over the end
Hmm.
credits. It's just genius. You know, he's like Mozart reincarnated. And then,
Yep.
but I love his orchestration of Anything Goes, the Cole Porter song. And so, to get back to the point, sorry, the
No, this is
Anything
all good.
Goes set piece is a Busby Berkeley homage. I don't know if you've ever seen any of those musicals from the 30s.
I have not.
Well, the idea was that to sort of, in a sense, to prove the superiority of the cinema format over the theatrical. So you'd often have musical numbers taking place on a stage, but then the camera would go into it and take you to parts of the set that no theatre audience could possibly see, and they'd have these massively elaborate dances. And you must have seen some of the iconic imagery of like the girls in the dancing girls in the swimming pool in
Yep.
formations, and
Yep.
all that stuff. The whole of that opening is a homage to those films. And the thing that's the thing that I like about it, it was literally the last thing I expected to see opening Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So that was, and it's completely different to Raiders, gives the film its own identity, even to the point that they use a different font for the opening credits to any of the other
Yep.
films. Now, some people say that makes it the bastard child of the Indiana Jones series, but personally, I love it. And I love what happens afterwards. I love the bit with Lao Chia, the Chinese gangster guy, the whole thing with the diamond and
Yep.
the poison and the antidote. And I love all of that. I mean, it's ridiculous, but I love it. I love the
Hmm.
chase, the car chase, the thing with the plane. All of that stuff it's one hell of an opening. And I just think, okay, fine. It opens with a musical number and it goes into all this craziness, but hey, it's really, it's kind of outrageous and over the top. And there's a Dan Aykroyd cameo. I don't know if you spotted that at the
I
airport.
did doing an
Um,
English
did,
accent. Yeah.
did you also know that George Lucas and Spielberg are in that scene too?
I didn't. I didn't know that.
They
No.
are, but again in the background, you have to blink and you'll miss them.
Right.
Um, at least I think they are. I'm sure. I'm going to have to double check that. I'm okay. Check that because I don't think I'm talking off the top of my head. I think they're both in the background there. But anyway,
Okay. So you like it. Now it's interesting because I think just listening to you, it sounds like you like it. I mean, obviously it's a wow moment. It's signaling this is a different kind of movie than Raiders. But I think a lot of the reasons you were responding to it is because it pays homage to other things, these other musicals. I don't like musicals,
yeah.
as you know. I'm not a musical guy, so for me, it's just it's a distraction, I guess. I don't love the scene. I like
I
everything
think
that
this.
comes
I mean, if you
after it.
don't like musicals, you don't have to wait long before the film gets on with the
Oh,
business of
sure,
an Indiana
absolutely.
Jones film. It's not, But I mean, I love musicals, and the thing is, I had seen some of those, Gold Diggers of 1933 and so on, films like that that it was paying homage to. So
Speaking of the opening, Kate Capshaw playing Willie Scott. This is her big moment. I'm curious for your take on Kate's performance and just the Willie Scott character. I think for me personally, Willie Scott is obviously she's far behind Marion as far as the leading lady. Uh, I almost prefer Elsa a little more because I think there's a little more interesting to her because she's a bit duplicitous, and then the fact that she's also sleeping with his dad is just it's just kind of funny. Um,
sorry, can I just pick up on something there?
yeah,
That
absolutely.
Elsa, the bit when he says she talks in her sleep in Last Crusade. When
Yes.
I was in the cinema, both times I saw it during the original run, there's a pause of, I don't know, however many seconds there when they kind of look at each other incredulously, and it's really funny because obviously Spielberg's put that in there, or the editor has, to make sure the audience gets all the laughter out of the way before the film carries on, because it is
Right.
hilarious. Yes, I
Absolutely.
mean Elsa, they do the sort of film noir femme fatale thing quite effectively, and as I've often said, this is one Elsa who couldn't let it go in Last Crusade. But anyway, that's sorry, that's a separate film. But
No, that's
with
a good.
Temple of Doom, yes, I think the Willie Scott. I mean, do I like her? Oh, I mean, Marion is obviously the superior character in
Hmm.
every possible way. Um, but and she's feisty and she's kind of got she's brilliant. But I would say that I understand what they were trying to do by, okay, so we make her a blonde and we are paying homage to the sort of 1930s 40s Saturday matinee serials of virgin being sacrificed into volcano to appease fire god, whatever kind of
Hmm.
nonsense. That's what they were going for. So it's in keeping with the genre to have the sort of, and the thing is, the Fey Ray thing can work, the screaming blonde, whatever. It can, obviously it works brilliantly in King Kong. It's just iconic.
Yep.
Regardless of the gender politics of the thing, it's just I mean it's immensely entertaining and it's iconic. This she is I understand why people find her a bit more annoying. So I completely get that. I personally don't, because again, I just makes me laugh. I mean, I don't really care how offensive it is. I just find it funny. I know it's offensive to some people, but that sort of sexism part of the film, I mean, it's yeah, it's problematic. I mean, I always say this: Temple of Doom, too violent, too sexist, too racist. We'll get to that in a minute. Guilty as charged on all three counts. I'm not going to argue that. Still love it though, and
Sure.
unrepentantly.
Hmm. Since you brought it up, the cultural elements have not aged well. I wasn't cognizant enough in 1984. I was 6 or 7 to know if this was offensive at the time. But watching it now, it certainly, the sequences in India, the
Well, they
in
shot it in Sri
particular,
Lanka. They shot it
they
in
did.
Sri Lanka
Yes.
because they couldn't, and I think the Philippines as well, because they couldn't get the script past the Indian censors. And yeah, I understand why.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah.
it's a bit slanderous. I mean, if you just look at it for the dinner scene alone, which for gross out comedy is probably one of the best scenes from the 80s for just kind of sheer like disgusting, like this
Well, the
is
chilled
gross
monkey
but I'm gonna
brains and all
laugh
the
at
rest
it.
of it. Yeah.
The chilled monkey brains, yeah, but at the same time I think and I've read some interviews with the Indian actors that were on the film. They even had problems with the scene at the time, but I guess Spielberg is, speaking of the dinner scene, Spielberg was trying to approach it as an in joke, like the Indians are much more intelligent than this, and this is kind of a jab at Western audiences who think that this is what
Yes.
Indians are like. But it doesn't. If that subtext is there, it's hard to pick up on because it
Yeah,
seems like the
I
joke is
think
being
it's
made
impossible to
against the
pick up on
Indians.
it. You'd
Yeah,
have to be told that to know that was Spielberg's intention. And this feeds into something else that I'm sorry, I keep saying feed in. It's a very repetitive phrase. Sorry, I should stop saying
don't worry
feed in.
about it.
Okay, well, this pertains to something that I often talk about, which is what you mean to do as an artist versus what an audience takes away, or a reader or whatever takes away from it. You are not in control of what they take away from the film. So if you don't convey what you intended to convey, then that's on you, not on them. So if you have to have that gag explained, then it doesn't work. I mean, personally, as a 9-year-old child, I just thought it was funny. I thought it was
Absolutely.
funny, it
Yep.
was gross, it was amusing. I didn't really think about the cultural aspects of it. As an adult, I think, well, clearly, um, that if there is a joke in there about the subtle joke, it's too subtle. It's about the fact that Westerners would think this is the kind of thing that they would serve, when of course Hindus would be vegetarian. But, and this is a
Yep.
key point, that is a key part of, there's actually been cut out of the film. There was originally a line where um Indy says something to the effect of, this is what's wrong, that something's wrong here, because Hindus should be vegetarians, they shouldn't be eating whatever, all this sort of stuff. And that was a plot point that then got cut out. So even again, what's presented, you don't have that context. Not that it should necessarily be there, because I think it works as a scene as it is, leaving aside the ridiculousness of the cultural aspect of it. Um, but no, we're definitely. I can understand why people would take offence at it. I mean, I don't. But then, But I would just say this: there was one actor. You mentioned actors who were obviously unhappy with how things were portrayed. Obviously, you've got this ridiculous thing of, in the background, it is a white savior narrative. It is,
Yep.
helpless Indian peasants, are rescued by a white messiah who comes and, in that. But again, in a sort of fairy tale vein. Um, what's interesting is Amish Puri, who famous Indian actor who plays Mola Ram, who's
Hmm.
very big in a lot of Bollywood films. In fact, after Temple of Doom, he kept his head shaved. I don't know if you knew that. After that film,
I
he
didn't.
never grew his hair again. But it's interesting. He didn't take offense at the film, and he wrote in his autobiography that he thought it was because he says, look, we, i.e., Indian people, do this all the time. We take our mythology, we do crazy things to it, we make ridiculous, but we're only his opinion. We're only griping about it now because white people are doing it. So he took a rather different view, and that's in his autobiography. You can look it up, but he took a different view. Obviously, that's one person. I know a lot of other people think differently on it. I think that regardless of what he thinks, those issues are definitely in the film. You'd be an idiot to ignore them. And yes, they were in the they were there was sorry, excuse me, there was quibbling about this at the time in 1984. So it's not some new hand wringing political correctness thing that everybody's decided to be posthumously offended about. It people were offended at the time. So
Right.
yeah, yeah.
So, yeah. Speaking of Mola Ram, I think he's an interesting villain in that in some ways he feels almost like a Scooby Doo kind of cartoony villain, like over the top melodramatic. But at the same time, there's this maliciousness at the heart of him that I think works in the movie. And obviously, he's got the great trick of just ripping people's hearts out of their chests. It's a bit undefeated when it comes to movies. Although I did laugh when at the end of the movie, Mola Ram and Indiana Jones are dangling from the bridge, and and Mola Ram tries to pull it on Indiana Jones as he's dangling over this huge drop. Maybe he needs to work on a second move that he can perform in more precarious situations.
You know what?
But
Maybe he just wasn't in the zone. He needed his temple. He needed his atmosphere. It was all
he
bright out
needed,
there in the
yeah,
sun with the bridge, and
yeah, he didn't have any mindless throng chanting
yeah.
Kaluma Kaluma. Yeah, he was out of his element. It was in the sunlight. So yeah. Anyway, I just as a villain, and again, and it's hard to compare this movie to Raiders of the Lost Ark, but it's almost impossible not to. Um, I just feel like Mola, he's a bit goofy for me. I don't know. How do you feel about him?
I think he's a perfectly good villain. And he's a nasty piece of work, and he should be. And he's appropriately scary, and again in keeping with that sort of dark fairy tale feel that the second one has. I mean, all the Indiana Jones films have supernatural elements of one kind or another, and they're invariably tied to religious beliefs. Whether it's Judaism or Christianity on either end, and Temple of Doom, obviously Hinduism and whatnot. But I do think that the dark fairy tale feel makes that appropriate. He is a Scooby Doo villain. He is all of the things you've just said. But I think you don't really need him to be anything more than just a one-dimensional, pun intended thug.
Hmm.
So so the thuggy cult, what have you. I mean, just by the way, just another thing. Speaking of the thuggies and the actual history of the thuggies with the British Empire and so on, and all of that's in the film as well. Just to really rub people's noses in it, Spielberg brings in the British military to polish them off at the
Yeah.
with Captain Bloombert, and it's which is another thing I just laughed my head off at. I have to be honest with you, because it's so absurdly offensive that in
Yep.
the kind of because it is just ridiculous. And but there is some truth to it. They did the British military and the thuggies and so on. That was a thing that really happened. It's just they were more akin to the mafia, I think, than they were or the sort of human sacrifice, all the rest of the rubbish that's been dreamed up in that film. And so anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Yep. So we've somehow gone almost 40 minutes on this without really talking about Harrison Ford, which is kind of mind blowing because for me growing up, Harrison Ford was the movie star, and it was basically on the foundation of Star Wars and the Indiana Jones movies. He was always my favorite actor. I think his performance in this movie is good. I think it's nuanced in that he's not doing his performance in Raiders is better in my mind, and it's a bit sillier in Crusade, but I think here in Temple he's tapping into something that neither of the other two films has. which of the, I guess, how do you view his performance in relation to the other films, and which do you prefer from a Harrison Ford
Well,
standpoint?
Raiders is top of the pile for me, just because I think that he's so iconic in that. I mean, he
Hmm.
is as iconic in that as Humphrey Bogart is in Casablanca. And by the way, speaking of Casablanca, obviously there's a direct homage at the start of Temple of Doom when he comes down in the white dinner jacket and so on and
Yep.
so forth. It's all very much tied into film nostalgia. So much of the certainly of the Star Wars films too, but especially the Indiana Jones film is tied into referencing Hollywood history and things, as we've already touched on. But
Hmm.
I love his performance in Raiders. I think that is the best. I think it's just note perfect. Now, Temple of Doom, I agree with you. He does do something different. He's more straightforwardly heroic, as I've said, and but because of also gets to play, when he's under the influence of the Kali blood thing.
Yep.
He's plays a different version of again, you're not going to see that in any of the other Indiana Jones films. Evil Indy, and that gives it interest and a bit more of a, I don't know. I think he's very good, because it would be easy to sort of play that wrong, and I think he got it just right.
Hmm.
Um, into the degree that the 9-year-olds in the audience, i.e., me when I was 9, really it was quite alarming. That bit when he's thrashing around with all the candles in the, and he's like having a whatever it is, a seizure, and he comes to, and I remember thinking, oh no, maybe he's all right, maybe he's all right, and then the camera kind of goes into his face, and no, it's not all right. He's
Yeah.
gone, he's gone nuts, and
He's gone.
that's actually fairly well done. I think that I mean, if we're going to talk about Harrison Ford performances, my all-time favorite Harrison Ford performance is Witness, hands down. But obviously, that's a serious film for grown-ups. That's not
Hmm.
Indiana Jones. But
Yep.
but in terms of his performances here, I think Temple of Doom is very good. Last Crusade, yeah, he's more comedic, as befits the tone of the piece, and he obviously
Yep.
has the chemistry with Sean Connery, the father-son thing going on, which I think is very well played. Um, yeah, I don't really think about the other two, if I'm honest.
I don't either.
Yeah, I mean, look, at least I've given this a lot of thought. This is irrelevant really to this podcast. Maybe cut this out, but at least Kingdom of the Crystal Skull had the original personnel, and I
Yeah.
think at least half of that film, probably the first half, I don't really have a problem with. I mean, the nuclear test thing with the
The
fabricated town
refrigerator.
and so on. That's
Yeah.
quite eerie. It works quite well. I mean, almost sort of. Um, I think that worked well. That was interesting. And then the bit where they go to, the sort of, there's a nice motorbike chase, and then there's the bit where they go in the tombs in somewhere in South America, can't remember where, and they, all that stuff, the booby traps. Up to that
Yep.
point, I kind of like it, and then it all goes south from there with silly CGI chases that
The
have no
swinging
real,
with the monkeys.
considering the weight and the heft that the truck chase in Raiders has, which is all real physical
Absolutely.
stunts,
Yep.
no CGI anywhere. It works so much better compared with what's in that. And then the dial of dysentery, dial of destiny, sorry. um you know i i I was only moderately fed up. It's not terrible, but there are some really really annoying things in it for me. And you may think, like, I mean, just for example, you got the big train chase at the start, and they've digitally de-aged Indiana Jones, and they put him on a, so you got a digitally de-aged Indiana Jones fighting on a train that's obviously all CGI backgrounds and everything else. And then, a week or two later, we had Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, which has a proper train chase, a proper fight
Yep.
on a train with a, that's all done for real with,
It's all
the
physical.
odd bit
Yep.
of wire removal. So it's like, you know what? I know which one thrilled me, and it wasn't the Indiana Jones one.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I have a lot of issues with Dial of Destiny. I won't bore you with that. That's
Yeah.
not
No. No.
relevant
I
to
think
this
that's
podcast.
fair. Well, I think in relation to Harrison Ford, it's interesting, and it's always been interesting and a bit heartbreaking to me that he has no problem walking away from Han Solo, but he can't let go of Indiana Jones. And really, if we're being honest, the only way he did say goodbye to Indiana Jones is because he has actually gotten too old to continue playing the role. I mean, that's what's really is going on here.
Well, he
Is
keeps getting
he
injured,
phys-
doesn't he?
Yeah,
I mean,
and he's,
I
I
mean,
mean, he's
it's
in
but
his
this is the
80s
thing with
now.
Harrison
Yeah.
Ford. This is the thing with Harrison Ford anyway. He got injured on the set of Temple of Doom. They had to do experimental back surgery to get him back
Yep.
into the
Yep.
production schedule. Then it happened on, I know it happened on The Force Awakens as well. He did something like a piece of the set fell on him, and then obviously Dial of Destiny. Yeah, yeah. I think it's time to call it a day with the action roles, Harrison.
Yeah. Unfortunately, but it's
And
always
you
been
know what? I just
interesting
want
to me. Go ahead.
sorry, I just wanted to say this one thing about Harrison Ford in Dial of Destiny, and it is that he gives it his all. He does, you know what I mean? He is not
Absolutely.
really the problem with that film.
Hmm.
So I
Yeah,
just wanted
I totally agree. As a yeah, as a swan song for the franchise, it's not what I hoped for, but as a swan song for the character, I was happy enough because I feel like what we got out of Harrison and the character was good, and I felt like it left in a good place. But then, like I said, it's always an interesting to me that it's almost like he can't let go of this character, this role. I think in a lot of ways it's him, or he sees himself in the role, or there's something about the character he just responds to that he's never, like, he actively despised Han Solo to the point where he only came back to do Force Awakens because they were going to kill him proper. Uh, but yeah, anyway, all that said, you brought up Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and we've talked a bit about Short Round. I love Short Round in this movie, and of course, I love the Goonies, and so I guess I'm curious: would Kingdom of the Crystal Skull been a better movie if it had been Short Round instead of Mutt, which is the worst name I've ever heard for a character? But Harrison's for Indiana Jones's biological son, right, versus his adopted kind of surrogate son in Short Round. Is it a better movie?
well, obviously, if it's however many years later, he would be an adult anyway. So I think you then lose the dynamic by making it short round. So no is the answer. I don't think it would necessarily have worked. Although Mutt is an adult technically as well by that point. So there's kind of there's sort of an argument either way. What I would say is, if you're interested, go online and read the Frank Darabont screenplay for Kingdom of the Crystal Skull that was then approved by Spielberg and Harrison as a sort of first draft. They would have obviously refined it. Okay, it's only a first draft.
Mm-hmm.
But then Lucas rejected, so they started again with I think David Coep, who did the final draft of the screenplay. But um, I think the Darabont version is a lot better of that
Well,
story of
he's
Kingdom of the
he's a
Crystal,
great
just as a
writer.
story.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah, he's a great writer. I was saying he's a great
did you?
writer. Frank is.
Oh, right. Did you read it? I thought you were saying you'd read it. Sorry.
I haven't read it. No, I'm just saying he's
No,
a
so
great
you
writer.
you you
So
haven't indulged in that particular avenue of time wasting then. No, I
no,
mean the fact is I was just curious, so I read the screenplay, and it is a lot more interesting in terms of how the story is handled. But I think I don't necessarily have an inherent problem with introducing a son for Indiana Jones, but it wasn't handled particularly interestingly. And because you've already done the father son story in Last Crusade so
absolutely.
satisfyingly,
Yep.
that's where it should have ended, as far as I'm concerned. You're not going to top that.
Yeah.
The
Well,
Holy
and
Grail, the idea that the Holy Grail is not the physical Grail, but it's the relationship restored between the father and the son. That's beautifully ironic, and it's restored because he lets the Grail go. And that's brilliant.
yes.
That's
Yep.
that's in keeping with the whole sort of spirit of the Arthurian myth in the first place. So
Yeah, and obviously that was the intent with Last Crusade. It literally ends with them riding off into the sunset. I don't know how you can interpret that any other way than
yeah,
this is the end, right?
yeah.
And they ran it back. Like I said, I don't know. I know Harrison loves the character. I don't know if Spielberg and Lucas just wanted to do more movies, or what the impetus was. But I agree with you that much like Star Wars, Indiana Jones would have been better if it had just been 3 films and done.
No
Uh,
argument from me there.
swinging back to Temple of Doom, there are a number of sequences in this movie that I love. I think probably my favorite. You mentioned, I guess I have a couple that are my favorite. You mentioned one of them already. It's the scene where Indiana Jones and Willie Scott have been flirting, and it looks like they're gonna have sex, and then they go off into their opposite corners, waiting for the other to come to their room. And then just the way Spielberg shoots it is very comedic. It's very light and fun. And then the reason Indiana Jones doesn't show up, of course, is because someone's trying to kill him. I love that scene. I think it's just even though this movie tonally is very dark, this is one of the lighter and more fun moments. And it's probably, it may be my favorite moment in the whole movie, which is kind of fun. I guess
Yeah, I mean
the
it's
other
it's the sort of 1930s romantic comedy screwball moment. Sorry, I interrupted you there. Carry on.
absolutely no. Go ahead. I was just gonna say that, and it just leads into my probably my actual favorite moment, which is when Indiana Jones and Short Round get trapped in the room with the spikes, and
Oh,
that whole
that's a
sequence.
brilliant bit. Yeah,
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
yeah, I mean, there's two dead people out here. There's going to be two dead people in here, and Willie, we are going to die. I mean, it's brilliant. That whole bit with the bugs and the spikes and the skeletons and everything in
Yep.
that is just, it's kind of roller coaster gonzo sort of, and it's great fun. And I think it's a really good sequence. My Probably when I was a child, my favourite scenes were actually the kind of the last two major set pieces, which is the minecart
The
chase
minecart. Yeah,
and the rope bridge, which is just
the bridge.
again a standout sequence. That you've got to have a rope bridge. By the way, I just want to say this about Temple of Doom, and this kind of slightly links in with what we were saying earlier about cultural inappropriateness, colonialism, what have you. It is very much inspired by, as far up to my mind, the film Gunga Din. I don't know if you've ever seen that, which is obviously based on the Kipling poem. And that film, it's got Clark Gable in it or Cary Grant. Yeah, I've gone blank. Anyway. It's a really good adventure picture from the 1930s, but it's got all the stuff from Indiana Jones. It's got a snake pit. It's got a rope bridge. It's got the thuggies. It's got all this stuff in it. It's like it's literally where they nicked all their ideas from. And so, I mean, I saw Gunga Din after I saw Temple of Doom. I was like, oh, that's where they got the rope bridge from. All that sort of stuff is it's straight out of that film. So it's a shameless ripoff, but it's done so well. I mean, the rope bridge,
It
the
is.
mine cars. I mean, there was one hilarious moment in the cinema when. When the car jumps from one set of rails to the other, and the kind of
Mhm.
soundtrack goes a little bit quiet, and then it lands on the, it's a ridiculous moment. I just remember a bloke who said, row behind, I don't believe it. And that's like, yeah, you can believe everything else, but you can't believe that. And
He
so,
was with the movie through the chest ripping and everything
yeah,
else, but you lost him at the minecart jumping
yeah,
tracks.
yeah, exactly.
Did you have any other standout sequences that you like?
I mean, look, there's lots of stuff in there. I mean, we talked about the opening. You've just talked about the spike
Mhm.
chamber and the bit with Willie Scott and the romantic bit. I'm gonna just, because everybody seems to hate the middle section with all the black magic and stuff. But you know what? That just as sort of, a full on horror moment in the middle of this supposedly family friendly film, the human sacrifice scene. I've got to give it credit for sheer balls, okay, for what they do there. And as I've said already, it's really what the set is beautifully shot and lit. The cinematography, the way it's edited, the way it's directed. I mean, I think it's some of Spielberg's best direction.
Mhm.
The way it's just purely on a technical level, it's really well put together. And yeah, I mean, it's I always liked that bit. I mean, I liked how dark it was. I liked that it really went there. So yeah, you won't find many people say that or will admit that, but I liked that about it. So
Hey, well, you be you, Simon. Speaking of the sacrifice, do you have any idea why they put a lay on the sacrificial victim before they send him down to be burned up by the lava?
what you mean, like the flowers?
Yeah,
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. I think it's just, again, he's borrowing. Lucas is borrowing from all over. I mean, you've got bits of voodoo culture in there. You've got bits of, so it kind of. I wonder if it's part of a sort of a Polynesian thing, where they put flowers.
yeah, yeah.
I don't. I honestly have no idea. I mean,
I
they
yeah.
just
It's just it
it
strikes
makes
me as
no
funny.
sense.
It
Or
strikes me as
or maybe
funny.
it's something. I mean, I'm ignorant. So maybe it's something in Hindu culture that I don't know about. I don't know. There could be. I honestly don't know. I have. I'm afraid I can't give you any opinion on that, other than
That's fine. I
yeah.
wasn't looking for an answer so much as
No,
just
I'm
poking
sorry to be
fun at
so
it.
ignorant on that point. I
No,
will
it's
actually now go and look that up because
no. Well, it just strikes me as funny because lays are traditionally used in Polynesian culture, like you mentioned. Like the big thing is when you arrive in Hawaii, they put one on your neck. It's a way of
Yeah.
welcoming you and stuff, and it generally has good vibes. So it's just funny to me that they take the time to put these lays on their victims before they send them down. It's just, I don't know. It's just one of those moments or one of those little things that you look at and it just makes me laugh, I guess. Before
Yeah.
they
I mean,
send them down to be burned,
it's
they
silly.
put
And it's a
flowers on
waste
them.
of good. It's a waste of good flowers.
That's true. Yep. I think we ran through everything I had here. Anything else you want to say about the film?
No, I mean, I think we covered it. We talked about. I think we talked about it. I mean, I think we've covered it. I think
I
we've
think we
talked
have.
Temple of Doom I
Into
think
the ground.
we've covered. People are look. I mean, people are either going to be like me and just unapologetically love it despite all the problems with it. I mean, I'm never going to argue it for as a great film in the same league as Raiders, but I will take Temple of Doom any day of the week and twice on Sundays over Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and especially Dial of Destiny. So,
I would agree with you.
it's yeah,
Yeah, I would totally agree with you on that. It is interesting, not to bring up Star Wars again, but I'm going to bring up Star Wars again. It is interesting that in the original Star Wars trilogy, Empire ends up the darkest film. It's the second film in the trilogy, and it's by and far the best film. And then with Indiana Jones, Lucas tries to kind of go in the same direction, making the second film darker. I think from reviews from things I've read, that was intentionally. I think obviously there was the personal stuff that were going on in their lives, but also he did want to go in a more darker direction, similar to what they did with Empire. It didn't land as satisfactorily for me, but obviously you like it a lot. It's just interesting that he's almost intentionally trying to mimic what he did with Star Wars with this film.
yeah. I think that's a valid point, and I think that going in a darker direction in Empire made sense. Perhaps it didn't with Temple of Doom. I still like it though. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
I
I
think that
appreciate that it tries something different. Is really when you look at the three
yeah,
Indiana Jones films, they are all like you said at the beginning of this podcast. They're not traditional sequels in that the story picks up the story, what had come before. They're actually separate movies that just happen to star the same main character, and they're set piece movies. They take place on their own apart from anything else, and there are some things that link them, like Marion and obviously Indiana Jones, but for the most part, they sit apart. And I think that works to their benefit, I think.
yeah, and obviously the Denham Elliott character as
Yes.
well. What's his name?
Yep.
Marcus,
Marcus.
he's a kind of serious character in Raiders, but then in Last Crusade he becomes comic relief,
He's a
very kind of
goofball.
awkwardly. I mean,
He
well, I say
is.
awkwardly. It works for the film, but I remember thinking that's a bit strange. He wasn't that inept in the first film.
Yep.
Anyway,
Yep. All right, I think we'll wrap up here, Simon. Thanks for joining me. Is there anything you want to plug before we drop off?
yes. Shameless self promotion. I write novels. Please do check them out. simondillonbooks.co.uk, I think is the website. Or just Google Simon Dillon Books, you'll find it. It's there. And various books available at all the usual outlets, thrillers, horror thrillers, kind of that's my main area of, but I've just branched into fantasy recently with a novel called Ravenseed. So do check that out, even if you're not a fantasy nerd. It's an epic tale of love, lust, betrayal, and vengeance, set mostly in the Dark Ages, but with a parallel plot in the present. And you really don't need to be a fantasy nerd to read this because it's not, I promise you, this is not about how many mana points it takes to kill a storm troll or, all the stuff that Eric loves, the Dungeons and Dragons y stuff. Please do have a look and check out my work. I'm also on Medium. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. Thanks. Thanks for
That's
coming on the podcast, Simon.
anytime.
Quick question: of all the books you've written, do you think is the most like Temple of Doom in terms of just subject matter or even just the same tone?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, because I have, there are a couple that have got cults in them. Um, Let me think about that. Tonally, I mean, I probably okay. So the most extreme in terms of horror that I've done is probably the Irresistible Summons, which that's interesting because for the most part that book is a sort of conspiracy thriller, but the final act is full on horror. And then obviously there's also a cult in Spectre of Springwell Forest, which is another scary one. That's a kind of a ghost story. So yes, I mean, check out both of those if you want, to see. Maybe you'll see some. I don't think there's much. It's them. Those are more sort of born from gothic mystery novels like Jane Eyre, The Woman in Black, more, and so on. That sort of, the Haunting of Hill House, that sort of thing. It's that sort of, rather than Indiana Jones. But I've written some adventure stories for children as well. I mean, there's a novel I wrote for children called Uncle Flynn, which I wrote for my eldest son, and that's set on Dartmoor. That's a treasure hunt adventure story, and that's very informed by the Goonies, Indiana Jones, but also things like Swallows and Amazons, the Arthur Ransom novels, and the Famous Five, and various other types of adventure stories. So, if you're young or young at heart, those are great fun too.
Awesome. Yeah, so if you like Indiana Jones, if you like Temple of Doom, Simon's got you covered with some novels. Definitely check them out. Simon, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on. Next week I'll be flying solo, hopefully talking about the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. This podcast is going to happen one of these days. It should be next week, but I'm not making any promises. In the meantime, have a great week. Peace out.